Okay.
Okay. All right. In Pashas Behar, so the Torah tells us about halachas of Yovel, Shemitah, Avadim, and at the end of the Sedra, on Perik Chavhei, Pasuk Chavav, the Baal Torah makes an interesting comment. And he says that the word Geula or Gulaso, words that that deal with redemption or freedom. So, but that use the word Gula is mentioned 19 times in this Sedra. And he says that the 19 times that the word Gula, freedom or redemption, is mentioned in the Sedra, corresponds with the 19 brachas of the Shemona Esrei. And so the question is, so why is it? He says, L'chein, the Baal Torah himself says, L'chein tzarech lahasmich gu'ula l'tfila. Therefore, there's a mitzvah of smichas gula l'tfila, of connecting. Gula, we say Gal Yisrael in the bracha before Shemona Esrei. We say Gal Yisrael. So, because 19 times the word Gula is mentioned. Now, the question is, it seems that this drasha, now, why he makes a drasha, I don't know if he found a basis in the Medrash for it. No one mentions it, or no one that I saw mentions a basis for it. But it's possible, very often, it does have a basis, or it's something that the Baal Torah thought of himself. But in general, we find that the Baal Torah looks to attribute words in the Torah in regard to Dinei D'Rabbanan, rabbinic mitzvahs. And this could be understood in light of the Shita of the Ritva, which is also the opinion of the Ramban. The Ritva Shita is that Chachamim couldn't make a takana, couldn't make a decree by themselves. In order to make a decree, the Chachamim had to find a drasha that allowed them, a drasha in the Torah, that allowed them to make the decree. In other words, we have drashos in the Torah that tell us dina d'oraisa, that tell us biblical laws. And we have drashos in the Torah that allows the Chachamim to make certain takanos. And when you look through the Baal HaTorah, although it's not compelling, but you certainly get the impression that the Ritva, that the Baal HaTorah himself had this approach of the Ritva. It seems perhaps in a limited way that the Ramban and Rashi also had this approach. And it seems that the Maharal is very strong, that the Chachamim couldn't make a takana just like that. they had to find a drasha that empowered them and allowed them to make a drasha. So now the mitzvah of smichas kula tefillah, the mitzvah of starting Shmoneh Esrei, immediately after saying Gal Yisrael, the bracha of Gal Yisrael, which talks about God redeeming the Jewish people, and to a certain degree about the Jewish people singing a shira upon their redemption from Egypt. So Shmoneh Esrei there should be nothing separated, at least in Tefillah Shacharis. There should be nothing separated between the bracha of Gal Yisrael, which speaks of the redemption of the Jewish people from Egypt, and the bracha and the brachas of Shmoneh Esrei and saying Shmoneh Esrei. But there is the emphasis that it's mentioned 19 times seems to indicate that it's not just that it's necessary in order to daven, that we should, the davening, the Shmoneh Esrei, the praying, the asking of God, from God, should be immediately after giving recognition to God as the Redeemer of the Jewish people. But it seems that it's necessary not just to elevate our status, to approach God, but it's necessary for the whole Shmoneh Esrei. In other words, 19 times Gula is mentioned in the Sedra to tell us about the 19 brachos, the 19 blessings that we say in the Shmoneh Esrei, most of which are requests, and to a large degree, all of whom are requests, even the Shevach and the Hodah, and the giving thanks, the praise of God, and the giving thanks to God is a form of request. First of all, there are requests included in the bracha. And then, without going into it in detail, but there seems to be many rayas, certainly from the Baal HaTurim, in other places, that the Shevach, the giving praise to God, and the Hodah, giving thanks, is part of the request. In other words, when someone comes to ask, you don't just ask, but you praise, you say thank you at the end, and you ask. But in its essence, the giving of thanks, the giving of praise in the Shmoneh Esrei is all part of the asking. So it's not just to elevate our status as free people to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Somehow, the smichas kula tefillah, the juxtaposition of putting the gula, speaking about the fact that God redeemed us, plays a role in every part of the Shmoneh Esrei, not just the act of standing before God. Now, there is a famous Reb Chaim about tefillah. I've mentioned it many times. There seems to be a contradiction in the Rambam as to whether you need kavanah, intention, focus in the whole Shmoneh Esrei or just in the first bracha. And Reb Chaim suggests, well, the first answer, which is the famous answer, is that there are two types of kavanah. One type of kavanah is knowing that you're standing before God. And if you don't have that kavanah, it's not that you didn't fulfill the requirement of davening. It's not davening. It's talking to the wall. The mitzvah of davening is talking to God. So you need that throughout the whole Shmoneh Esrei. Because if you don't have that intention, if you don't have that realization as you're davening, that you're talking to God, you're talking to the wall, you're not talking to God. It's considered like you didn't say those parts of the Shmoneh Esrei. And then there's the kavanah of Perish Hamilim, of understanding what you're talking about. So that, the Rambam says, according to Reb Chaim in his first answer, that's only in the first bracha. But then, Reb Chaim gives another answer. He says there's a general rule that when it comes to mitzvos, Reb Chaim says we paskin, even though there seems to be other Reb Chaims that seem to go against this. But Reb Chaim says in the Sefer here, we paskin mitzvos shrichas kavanah. In other words, when you do a mitzvah, when you take lulav and esrog, to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav and esrog, you have to have in mind, I'm taking this lulav and esrog in order to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav and esrog. And Reb Chaim says the same thing is true about davening. And Reb Chaim's opinion, even though I think the Avnei Nezer disagrees with Reb Chaim on this, that the law of having kavanah to fulfill a mitzvah is necessary throughout the whole duration of the mitzvah. It's not enough to have that kavanah just at the beginning of the mitzvah, but it's necessary throughout the whole duration of the mitzvah. So, therefore, a person, when he's davening, he fulfills a mitzvah of davening, of praying, of speaking to God, asking God for help. There's a mitzvah of avadatem, and you shall serve God. So you should have in mind throughout the whole Shmoneh Esrei, I'm davening in order to fulfill the mitzvah of davening. But then to understand why, to what degree, what I'm saying, to understand the words, the idea. So a person, lechatchila, should try to understand the words. If he has the ability, he's required to understand the words in the first bracha of the Shmoneh Esrei. Why the first bracha? Okay, that's not, it's something to discuss another time. But my father and my uncle had a lot of trouble with this answer of Reb Chaim, because this answer of Reb Chaim implies that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of davening, you need to have intention to fulfill the mitzvah of davening. And my uncle asked, he says, on the contrary, he says, yes, there is a dispute in regard to other mitzvos, in regard to taking the lulav and esrog, whether it's necessary to have kavanah, to have intention to fulfill the mitzvah. But he says in regard to davening, he thinks davening should be an exception for the mitzvah. Because what is the kavanah you have? What is the intention? What is the mental focus you have when you have kavanah? I am doing this in order to fulfill the command of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God. And when it comes to davening, a person shouldn't have that in mind. On the contrary, when it comes to davening, I am davening because I want to make a connection with God, not because I'm commanded to daven. Yes, it is a command. certainly according to the Rambam's opinion. But I shouldn't have in mind that that's the reason I'm davening. I should have in mind that because that negates the whole idea of davening. The idea of davening is making a connection. I want to daven because of what davening is, not just because I am commanded to daven. Matter of fact, many ask, why is it that Tfilas Arvis is Rishus? That Ma'ariv, in the earlier days, was considered a voluntary tefillah. Why should the tefillah of Yaakov, Ma'ariv, is identified as the tefillah of Jacob? Jacob davened Ma'ariv. Avram davened Shacharis. Yitzchak davened Mincha. Yaakov davened Ma'ariv. So why is it that the tefillah of Avram, the davening of Avram, is a required tefillah? The tefillah of Yitzchak is a required tefillah. The tefillah of Yaakov is a voluntary tefillah. I think, my memory serves me correctly, the Zohar phrases the question in a stronger way. Yaakov is the Behar Avos. He's the chosen one of the patriarchs. So why should his tefillah be the voluntary tefillah? And just want to mention, not that we can't add things to it, but I think that it's not a degradation of the tefillah that it's a voluntary tefillah. On the contrary, we could say that tefillas Arvis is rishus. That's the ultimate tefillah. I daven tefillas Arvis shows when a tefillah is a required davening. So I'm davening. I know this doesn't work out according to all shitos, but according to some shitos, it does work out. I'm davening because by Ma'ariv, I'm davening because I want to make a connection with God. Tfilas Arvis is Rishus. So, yes, Yaakov is the Behar Avos, the chosen one of the Avos. So, and in a sense, therefore, Tfilas Arvis being associated with Yaakov is neither a degradation of Yaakov, nor is it a degradation of Tfilas Ma'ariv. It talks about wanting to have a connection, with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God. So my uncle, he raised the question. He didn't discuss about Ma'ariv, at least that I'm aware of, what I just said. But he says davening is a mitzvah that mitzvah's shrichas kavana doesn't apply. We should daven Ma'ariv because we want to daven Ma'ariv. The truth of the matter is, if you look carefully through the Reb Chaim, without asking the question, indicates a possible answer to that question, but that's for another time. But I want to suggest my own answer to that question. Now, and my father, when my father raised the question, my father raised a similar question, but coming from a different point. He says, Shlomo HaMelech, when he built the Beis HaMikdash, when he was Mispal to Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ki Beisi Beis Tefillah Yikarei L'chol Amim. The Beis HaMikdash will be a house of prayer for all the nations. And when he says there'll be a house of prayer for all the nations, it means all the nations could come and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and make a connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Beis HaMikdash. Tefillah was not something that was restricted to the Jewish people. On the contrary, we want all of mankind to make a connection to God. Of course, the Beis HaMikdash is not a home of ecumenical prayer. If they want to come to pray in the Beis HaMikdash, it has to be based on our perception of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not chas v'shalom on their perception of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't have to have every person doing their own thing to that degree. They don't have to daven Shemona Esrei, but they have to be mispalo to the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the God of the Jewish people. There is no room. This is not a foundation, chas v'shalom, for ecumenical services that many are pushing today. But in an appropriate manner, the nations of the world can come to the Beis HaMikdash, to the house of God, to be mispalel to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to daven, to pray, to make a connection with Him, even to bring korbanos to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now, the mitzvah din of kavanah, what is kavanah? Kavanah is, I'm doing it because there is a special mitzvah. Who was the mitzvah of davening given to? The mitzvah of davening was given to the Jewish people. If kavanah, intention, in davening manifests itself, as Reb Chaim says, in fulfilling the mitzvah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the command of God. And the nations of the world were not given this command regarding davening. It's not one of the Shiva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. So how could we say, on one hand, that davening is something universal, ki beisi beis tefillah yikari l'chol ha'amim, and on the other hand, say that kavanah, intention, to fulfill the mitzvah is a prerequisite for the mitzvah of davening? That's how my father phrased the question. Now, very often in the past, I've mentioned that in Vayakel Pkudei, the Torah tells us about the actual construction of the Mishkan. And the Torah repeats over and over again that the Jewish people did it, kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe, like God commanded Moshe. As a matter of fact, the Yerushalmi says that it's mentioned 18 times. And that's why, and the Baal Turim brings it down also, that's why originally there were 18 brachos in the Shemona Esrei. And then, when they added a 19th bracha, it's pointed out there was another statement of that nature. And they used that to correspond with the 19th bracha. And the question is, what is this? Kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe. 18 or 19 times have to do with davening. Now, and then also, in regard to the Mishkan, and get also in Vayakil Pkudei, the Torah talks about the work and the construction of the Mishkan. It uses two terminologies for it. One terminology is melacha, work, and the other terminology is avoda, also work. And the question is, why two terminologies are used to describe the nature of the work that was done in the Mishkan? And my father mentioned, and I've mentioned this many times, that the melacha is to be differentiated from avoda. Avoda is servile type labor. My father said melacha, we talk about meleches machshavas, a thinking form of work, a planned form of work. My father says that's more, could be identified with an artistic form of work. And what's the difference between art form of work and a servile form of work? My father says when an artist does work, he injects his personality in his work. He identifies with his work. When a servant or a slave does work, he just does work. He is not injecting his personality into the work. He's not identified with the work. And the Jewish people, my father said, when they did the avoda, when they built the Mishkan, they identified with the work. They injected their personality. Of course, they did it kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe. But emotionally, they were putting themselves into the Mishkan. They injected their personality in the Mishkan. They identified with the Mishkan. But then the question, and my father did not address that question, at least that I heard. Okay, so why don't we just refer to it as malacha? Why mention avoda? And I think because there's a difference between artistic work or an artist, an artist and a laborer, and a servant and a slave. And the artist doesn't belong to the man who commissioned him or to the person who commissioned him to make a certain creation. He agreed to produce something, and he will produce it. And the final product will belong to the person who commissioned it. Whether halachically it works that way or not, separate issue. But that's the metzius. However, a slave, a servant, he belongs to his master. So on one hand, the Jewish people, when they built the Mishkan, when they built the tabernacle, when they built the temple, they injected their personality into the Mishkan. To the same way, in the same degree that an artist injects and identifies with his creation, injects his personality and identifies with his creation. But on the other hand, when the Jewish people built the Mishkan, it was indicative and was expressive of the fact that they belong to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the manner a servant, a slave, belongs to his master. Now it's interesting. The Torah, when we think about davening, we could think about davening from two perspectives. We could think about davening as making a connection to God. But we could think about davening, because I'm told that davening, the mitzvah, va'avadetem, and you shall serve him. It's the word avodah. That implies that from the perspective of the mitzvah of davening, the mitzvah of davening is not just making a connection to God, but in making a connection to God, it's expressive of the fact that we are in God's service. We belong to him. As the pasuk says in this week's Sedra, Avadaihem, when I took them out of Egypt, from the bondage of Paro, I took them into my service. They became my avadim. When we daven, it's not just to make a connection. When we daven, we do it to be in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We want to make a connection with God. But there are all kinds of halachos, all kinds of laws, how to make a connection. First of all, just giving examples, the first three brachos, not just this on a rabbinic level, but on a d'oraisa level. I know the Magen Avram says to the contrary, but Reb Chaim felt that mid'oraisa, to fulfill the mitzvah of davening, and the davening is a mitzvah d'oraisa, certainly according to the Rambam. So there is a particular manner that you have to daven. You start off with shevach, with praise of God. And then you have bakashas tzorchav, what you're asking God for. And then you have hodah, you have thanking God. And if you don't follow that system of davening, you do not fulfill the mitzvah of davening. But if you cry out, God, help me, you might not fulfill the mitzvah of davening. But it is a form of a tefillah. It is making connection to God. The mitzvah of davening as a mitzvah is fulfilled only if it's done in a prescribed manner. But you don't have to do it in a prescribed manner in order to make a connection with God. Of course, that's probably a preferable way to make a the prescribed manner is the preferable way to make a connection to God. But you can make a connection. Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillah, Kel na Rafan Allah. Okay, Kel na. God, that could be praise of God. Rafan Allah. When he davened to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Miriam's behalf, send her a healing, a refuah. There's no hodah, no thanks. But it was making a connection. It was making a connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And It was a prayer that was answered. And God answers prayers, even if it's not done in the formal manner. See, the non-Jew is not the mitzvah of tefillah is the mitzvah of davening in a prescribed manner. It doesn't mean that every time we daven to God, we have to do it in the prescribed manner. But at least once a day on a biblical level, according to the Rambam, and 3 times a day on a rabbinic level, it has to be done in the prescribed manner. But there are other ways to make a connection to God. And those are also forms of tefillah. So when the Torah tells us that in regard to my uncle's question against Reb Chaim, you should daven because you want to make a connection. Yes, you should daven because you want to make a connection to God. But the mitzvah of davening is when you do that in making that at least once a day, when you make that connection to God, you should do it in a prescribed manner. And when I say Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, as God commanded Moshe, so I have kavana to do it. My kavana, I'm davening to God because I want to make a connection. But why am I davening in this form and in this shape? Is because Kasher Tziva Hashem es Moshe, because this is the way the halacha, both on a biblical level and on a rabbinic level, prescribe that the mitzvah of davening should be. So there is a difference between just making a connection and the mitzvah of davening. And the mitzvah of davening is identified with ba'avadetem, of being indicative of being in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Some could do momentary service, but when the Jew davens, the davening of the Jew has to be indicative of his always being in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I once brought down the name of Rav Kook, and a similar thought my father expressed in a different language. But davening is really 24 hours a day. 24 hours a day. We have to realize that we're 24 hours a day standing in front of God. But when we daven once a day or 3 times a day, that's just expressive of the fact that we're standing God. What does it mean? It means that the davening, the mitzvah of davening for a Jew has to emanate from the fact that he recognizes, this is what I think, he has to recognizing that he is in the service of God. It's not just davening, it's avoda, it's servitude. So when we daven, we have to see ourselves as being in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's interesting. So that's why he based tefillah Yikari l'chol amim, the nations of the world, so long as it's done in a proper manner. It doesn't have to be in the prescribed manner, but it has to be in a proper manner. Not chas v'shalom, the prayers of the nations of the world use today for idolatry. But it's indicative. The Beis Hamikdash is there for all of mankind to make a connection with God. To make a connection with God. And but by the Jew, we do it. the mitzvah of davening is to do it in a prescribed manner, and the kavanah we have is to do it in that prescribed manner. And to a degree, when we are servants or slaves of others, we are slaves or servants of others. So then we, to that degree that we are servants or slaves of others, it takes away from our being in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the service of God. And that's what this week's Sedra at the end, it says, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim, because to me, the children of Israel are servants or slaves. Avadayim, they are my servants. Asher hotzeisi osam me'eretz Mitzrayim, ani Hashem Elokeichem. And Tefillah Shmoneh Esrei is a demonstration of that service. So we start off before the Shmoneh Esrei. It's Gal Yisrael. It's recognition, recognizing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu freed us to put us in His service. And that's, to a certain degree, is perhaps why there is Geula right before the Shmoneh Esrei, because unless we recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of the service of Paro to put us in His service, and we recognize, unless we recognize that we're free from everybody else's service, that takes away from us being in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which the Shmoneh Esrei, the Tefillah, is indicative of. Now, the whole Sedra about freeing slaves, Jewish slaves. Matter of fact, the Torah says that in the Rashi in Parshas Ve'era, right? Rashi says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he told that he commanded the Daber Paro Melech Mitzrayim, Daber Bnei Yisrael, Paro Melech Mitzrayim, Lahotzias Bnei Yisrael Me'eretz Mitzrayim, the Parsha of Eved Ivri. He told him to tell the Jewish people about the laws of a Jewish slave, a Jewish servant, how you have to treat him, how when you have to let him go free, and all of that. Why is that? So of course, Rachmanis, but it's not just that. Unless we recognize that the other Jew is free, is not a slave, then to a certain, and that he's entitled to freedom, then we don't recognize that we're entitled to freedom, that we are free. And what is our freedom manifest itself? Our freedom manifests itself in being servants to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, being in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in His constant service. So I think that the idea is that we have to recognize when we daven that we're in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, what does it mean to be in the constant service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, especially regarding tefillah, especially regarding davening? Now, I have discussed in the past the first time that we confront the laws of kashrus in the Torah. I mean, there might be indications earlier, but when Noach gives his korbanos, so Noach was told by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to have more behemoths tahoros, more kosher animals than non-kosher animals. And the reason Noach understood was in order to give korbanos, in order to give sacrifices. So we come to the recognition of the concept of behemoths tahoros first in Parshas Noach. But when do we come to learn the halachas of kashrus? That's much later in Chumash Vayikra. It's very strange. I would have thought the reverse. To learn about behemoths tahoros for korbanos should come after the laws of kashrus. Okay, couldn't do that by Parshas Noach. The laws of kashrus were not yet applicable. But even you take a look at Chumash Vayikra, we first are introduced to the laws of korbanos before we get into the laws of kashrus. So it seems that logically I would have assumed the laws of kashrus is the determining is necessary to understand the laws of korbanos. No, it's important to understand the laws of korbanos in order to understand the laws of kashrus. Why is that? And I've mentioned, because I mentioned the story that I heard from my Rabbi in high school, Reb Chaim Siegel. He was, later on, he became the Menal of Yeshivas Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin, of the high school there. He had a very big influence on many, many, many Talmidim. And I remember he once told us in Shir, that when he was a Talmud in Yeshivas Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin, he was in the early years of Yeshivas Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin. He went over to one of the Rebbeim there. He said him and a number of his friends who had learned in the Radin Yeshiva, the Yeshiva of the Chavetz Chaim. I assume he didn't tell us, if my memory serves me correctly, he didn't say which one of the Rebbeim in Chaim Berlin, but I assume it was Rav Shorkin, was one of the outstanding Magidei Shir in the United States, a great Talmud Chacham, and who was a Talmud of Rav Naftali Trupp, I think, in the Radin Yeshiva. I assume it was him. I don't know for sure. And he said, people say all kinds of stories about the Chavetz Chaim. You learned in Radin. Tell us a true story. Rav Moshe Feinstein once said, someone told him over something about one of the Dolim. It's a very strange story. And Rav Moshe Feinstein says, I don't believe that the story is true. So the person says, but it's written in books. He says, Rav Moshe Feinstein says, they write things in books about me and I'm still alive. Can you imagine the stories they write about people who lived 200 years ago? Chavetz Chaim wasn't 200 years ago. That was about somebody else. So this is, I think I saw that in Rav Aaron Felder's Sefer, that Moshe Feinstein said it. So they knew that many of the stories that people say about the Golem were made up. Usually it starts off, somebody says, I'm sure that this and this happened. And the next person said this and this happened. And then more and more details are created from person to person. He said, can you tell us a true story about the Chavetz Chaim? So he said, whoever the Rosh Yeshiva was, I think it was probably Reb Shurkin, said, we once wanted to hear what goes on in the Chavetz Chaim's house. So we snuck underneath the window. There was an open window. And we wanted to hear what the Chavetz Chaim is saying. And the Chavetz Chaim was talking to his wife. It apparently was the kitchen where they were eating. And the Chavetz Chaim said to his wife, could you give me another portion of a certain food so I should be able to have strength to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu better? In other words, the Chavetz Chaim, of course, if we would talk that way, it would be gaiva, arrogance, besides being not truthful. But this is what should be our goal. The Chavetz Chaim, when he ate to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In a sense, we could say that each person has to be a mizbeach. When he eats, he's eating, the food he's eating is for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was given to him by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Torah and Kashrus is introduced to us with the laws of Korbanos, because Korbanos is the idea of giving over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We think that when we eat, when we are in the highest level, of course, most people, it's theirs. They start off. No. We think when we're in a little bit of a higher level, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives it to us. But the Chavetz Chaim, it wasn't just that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave it to us. The pshat is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives it to us, and we give it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In a sense, with the Gemara in Brachas has a contradiction between two psukim. One pasuk says, "L'Hashem haaretz u'loah," the whole world belongs to God, and then it says, "Hashemayim shemayim l'Hashem, ba'aretz nasan l'bnei adam." So the Gemara says, "Kan kodem bracha, kan la'achar bracha." This is before a bracha and after a bracha, and the general explanation. And certainly from the Tosfos it appears that way, is that before we make the bracha, it belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. After we make the bracha, it belongs to us. My father suggested we could say the reverse also. Before we make the bracha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave it to us. But when we make the bracha, we're giving it back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We recognize that it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're sanctifying it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a form of hekdesh, not real hekdesh. We're giving it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in a sense, all of Karbonis is like that. We give ourselves. My uncle pointed out that after, I gave a shir on this, but after Noach's Karbonos, so we find that the Yavos until the Akedah Avram, after the Karbonos that Noach gave, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Avram built Mizbechos, 3 mizbechos before the Akedah. The Akedah was the 4th mizbeach. 3 mizbechos, and in those 3 mizbechos, he gave him. In those 3 mizbechos, it doesn't mention that he gave a carbon. Vayivim mizbeach, vayikra b'shem Hashem. He built the mizbeach. My uncle suggested until the Akedah, he didn't put karbanos on it. What was the purpose of Behar? He gave himself over. It was symbolic. The old Avodah Zarah were giving karbanos. They felt they were feeding HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Abraham, in a sense, was showing, no, we're giving ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was the carbon. He came close to God. He was giving himself, wasn't coming close to God. He was giving himself over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And with the Akedah came the idea of me, the carbon in place of me. Symbolic, I'm giving myself over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the idea of Karbanis is called Avoda also, because we give ourselves over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the connection between tefillah and davening. It's giving ourselves, recognizing that we belong to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So so when we get something, when we get something for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's for our benefit. It's not just for our benefit. It's for our benefit. We use our benefit for the benefit of, in a sense, not that HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs it, but symbolically for the benefit of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As the Chavetz Chaim said, give me something so I could be stronger to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu better. That's the idea. That's the idea of Avodah. Now, and Geula, the Geula represents this idea. Now, in the whole Shemon Esrei, what is the whole Shemon Esrei? The whole Shemon Esrei is asking, and I believe, at least according to the Baal Torah, that even the first 3 brachas and the last 3 brachas is part of the Bakashas Tzorcha. But we ask in a certain manner, in a prescribed manner. And we ask in a certain manner, besides the fact that all the brachas have some type of Bakashas Tzorcha anyway. But it's part of the asking. It's to emphasize the reason 19 times. The reason 19 times we say Geula, Smichas Geula Tefillah, is because the Geula is what gives us the ability to be in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we have to know whatever we're asking for in the Shemon Esrei, we're not just asking it for ourselves, but LaHashem Haaretz U'Mloah. We want to dedicate everything that we have, that we get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not just to give us the ability to daven, to be on that level to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but to be in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the recognition that everything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us, when we take it, we're taking it to give it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be in His service. We're not on that level, but the goal would be to have the approach, and B'zir Anpin at least, that we're acting in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and all our benefits are for the benefit of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The whole Shemon Esrei is Bakashas Tzorcha, but it's Bakashas Tzorcha, our Tzorchen, but we use what we get, our Tzorchen, we use for our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat.
the general. Yeah, just one thought I want to say that the Rabbi Yehuda Levi, I always mention it. My parents mentioned, or would always mention that Rabbi Yehuda Levi says that Avdei Hazman Heim Abadim Labadim, Avdei Hashem Heim Rak B'nei Chorin, or something along those lines. That the servants of the slaves of time are the slaves of slaves. The slaves of God are truly free. Unfortunately, we find, what does it mean to be the slaves of time? I've spoken many times about it, but today we see a new pshat in Avdei Hazman. People become servants to the thinking of the times. People call me, they say they're friends who are not Jewish. Used to be their friends. Now they're not their friends anymore. And unfortunately, we find Jews, they become slaves of the trends of the time. And that's what we're seeing today on the college campuses, and the few fools, Jewish fools, who joined them, who eventually will suffer at their own hands, they are Avdei Hazman. They are slaves of the trends of the times. And there are rabbis, and there are people who consider themselves the leaders of the Jews of the United States. They're only Avdei Hazman. They're slaves of slaves. And the only true servants, the ones that follow the Jewish spirit, those who could lead the Jewish people, are the ones that the Avdei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, are the servants of God. Okay, I just want